March.
Okay, because I
Where's
knew it
Carrie?
wasn't
Let Carrie do
February.
that.
Carrie's
Yes, I
gone.
know, I'm gonna get that flyer to you.
She wasn't feeling well, I
March
guess.
31st, 3 o'clock. It'll
Okay.
be slightly, the front gate knows you're coming, it's in the clubhouse.
We were there last year. It's a
I
cool
was
place.
about to say, it's a fun place, and last year we had about 100. So I think we'll probably have a little bit more this year. And you know, we laugh a lot, but of course we're serious about the Word of God. But it's hard, and this one, I don't know how to get around it. It's kind of got a little triple X in there, you know. But it's not me. I didn't write it. You know? Don't blame it on me. But I think you'll enjoy the program, and it's multimedia. So I'll have a PowerPoint. It'll be fun. Next week, a whole new program begins here. I've been writing it. For those of you who were with me before when we started to walk through the Old Testament, through the Torah, I'm doing the same thing, only now with the Gospels. And I'm starting with the book of the Gospel of Mark. We're going to talk about who he is, or who do people say he was, just like that's one of the major questions in the book of Mark. Jesus keeps saying, who am I? Who do you think I am? Who do they think I am? You know, and Mark goes through that for over 15 chapters trying to determine who Jesus is. And I think Mark will probably take us to seven weeks. And if you like that, we'll go on to Matthew. You know, otherwise we'll find something that works for us, because this is your time, your time to spend in the Word with the Holy Spirit. And now I ask the Holy Spirit to join us as we complete the final presentation of this series. So today we're going to look at Rome and Christianity. Now, since we started the series, we looked at the way Greece grew into an empire, which was led by Alexander the Great. And then we spent a day learning about the pleasures and the dangers of living in Rome in the first century. And did anyone get a chance to read Juvenal, the writer of the satires? You really should try. You'll hate him because he can be so obnoxious, but he's so funny, and you'll really get to know Rome better. His name is spelled Juvenal, Juvenal. And you can read him in English. He doesn't lose a lot in the translation. And after that, we looked at the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. And there were a lot of similarities, but there were a lot of differences too. And then last week, we looked at how the Jews in tiny little Israel influenced those mighty empires of Greece and Rome, and really how Judaism influenced the early Christian church. So last week we saw that for the very first time in human history, there was one nation who proclaimed slavery is wrong. And other nations heard the Jews proclaim this, and especially the empires heard it, Greece and Rome. And remember, Greece and Rome both had huge numbers of slaves built into the infrastructure of their empires. So that kind of belief was dangerous to them. So little tiny Israel, so hard to imagine, becomes dangerous to these huge empires of Greece and Rome. And last week we also heard all about the religious, ethical positions of the Jews when it came to the sanctity of human life, and that's all human life. The Jews believed that their God insisted all life is sacred, even the lives of the elderly, the sick, the unwanted babies. And it's so interesting because the Greeks and the Romans found that belief very odd. They'll write over and over again, that is so unrealistic. It's hard for us to imagine. And that brings us to today, to our final presentation in this series. How did the Roman Empire become a Christian empire? Because it did. How did Christianity grow out of Judaism to become a world religion? And it did grow out of Judaism. We all know that what we call Judaism started out as a Jewish sect. So how did this tiny Jewish sect, which was led by a Jewish preacher named Jesus, how did it spread to every corner of the world with more members than any other religion that the world has ever known? How did that happen? And we're going to look at that today. So today we're going to spend some time with Jesus in the Roman Empire, which, by the way, didn't start out as an empire. It started out as a kingdom. Then it grew into a republic, and then it grew into an empire. And it's a really good story. So now let's take a look at where the Roman world began and how it grew and how and when it ended. And I think that we can safely say that the year 625 BCE, that's really the year of the founding of the city of Rome. It was a long time ago. Then Rome was established as a city-state, very similar to those city-states in Greece. And we're not sure why Rome was established where it was, or why it was even established as a state. But it probably has to do with defense, keeping it safe from enemies. And Rome seems to have been established in a pretty good spot, because just 50 years later, Rome was in fact a city, a standalone city, didn't need the state anymore. And then it really did take off. And for the next 100 years, Rome lived through a period that's known as the period of the kings. Kings, all the kings ruled from Rome. And there were 6 of them during this period. And it was a relatively stable time of growth for Rome, thanks to its military successes. They were really good at that. And also because of trade and commerce. Rome was really good at both of those things. They were good at gaining land, and they were good at cornering the markets. Romans were good businessmen, especially good in the oil business. And by that I mean olive oil business, yeah. Not like the sheiks, right? And it was during this time that a document known as the Roman Constitution was written. At least the early form of the Constitution was written. But I thought that was pretty impressive, right? Rome. You just don't think of them as a constitution governed by kings. But as I'm sure you can imagine, Rome got many of the ideas in that document from the Greeks, like the political structure of their preferred government. That was a Greek-style government. And we know a lot about the writing of the Roman Constitution thanks to a Greek writer and philosopher by the name of Polybius. He wrote a lot about what the Romans wrote because he was held as a hostage by the Roman framers of the Constitution. They wanted his help because he had a lot of experience with democracy. So they went to Greece, captured him, took him back to Rome, and they insisted while they were holding him that he share his knowledge about democracy. But of course, democracy in Greece then, it wouldn't look like the democracy that we're familiar with. But still, Polybius really came to admire the Romans. But see what you think about this constitution. It was based on the works of Plato and Aristotle, who definitely were not the Thomas Jeffersons of their day, right? So it was a bit limiting when it came to participation for all people. Frankly, the Greeks, and mostly I mean the well-educated Greeks, they didn't think that most people were capable of governing themselves. They believed the people needed government to tell them what was best for them, like how they should educate their children and where they should work and what they should eat and who they should trust. Now, does any of this sound just a little familiar, right? Now, the educated Greeks of that time, they firmly believed that any popular control of government would just lead to tyranny. So most Greeks believed that the aristocracy would do a much better job than the people could do when it came to making laws. And the Romans seemed to be on the same page. But at least the Romans had a constitution, and the kings used it. That didn't happen in Greece. So then, in Rome, we enter another long period in history that lasts from 500 BCE to 31 BCE. And we call this period the Republican period. And there are no kings anymore. Now there's a new kind of government. This is upper class rule, spearheaded by political leaders, like senators and money men also, men like equestrians. These were men who had enough money to buy horses, and military men like knights. So now we have political men with money and access to weapons running the government. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, one thing that went right is something called the 12 Tables. Have you ever heard of that document? It was established as the first legal code that was ever written in Rome. But of course, we can't leave out the Greeks either. Greeks were sitting at that table too. So the story is that Rome sends legal scholars to Greece to study their legal codes, and then the Romans come back to Rome and they write the 12 Tables, which just about covers everything, all aspects of life, like kids and women and marriage, and all kinds of things that change as the times change. And things really were changing in Rome very rapidly, because Rome and the Republic are growing very rapidly, and they keep growing. And of course, this growth means that the Romans are fighting with everyone, but they're winning. So they're gaining more territory and gaining more people to govern. And they're especially fighting with Greece now. They're engaging in these major battles. You've heard of them, like the Battle of Carthage or the Battle of Corinth. And that gives Rome, when they win those battles, complete control of that Mediterranean basin. So things are looking good for the Romans. Way too good to last, because they're not fighting with just their enemies anymore. Now they're fighting with each other. So now there are a whole series of civil wars, politically, militarily, that cause equal chaos. All different factions are trying to grab power from other Roman factions. And that's when it hits the fan. Shift happens. You thought I was going to say that. This is a Bible study, right? Yeah. Rome shifts from republicanism to imperialism. And this shift is really evident when Julius Caesar comes to power in 60 BC. He was a good conqueror, and he proves that when he conquers Gaul. Gaul, you know Gaul was a very important area. But today, Gaul is France and Belgium and most of Western Germany and pretty much all of northern Italy. Well, Julius Caesar conquers all that for Rome. So now Gaul is gone, and it really is gone. There are no more Gauls anymore, because all that Gaul DNA has been diluted by the Romans bringing in people from other places. So today there are Italians and there are Belgians and there are Germans, but there are no Gauls. And in the year 44, there's no more Julius Caesar because he's assassinated then. And Octavian replaces him. Do you remember Octavian? He used to be a co-ruler with Mark Antony, but then that didn't work out. So in 31, Octavian conquers Egypt, and Mark Antony dies then, and then Octavian becomes Augustus, and that's when all the trumpets blast, right? Da 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 da, because he's the first Roman emperor. But then it splits into two empires, one in the west and one in the east, and these were ruled by two different emperors. But alas, that couldn't last, and the west died first. But the Eastern Empire stayed on, and some scholars say the Eastern Empire didn't die until the Turks took Constantinople in 1453. Long time, but not everybody agrees with that. So talk about a quick trip through time, right? I need to drink. Interesting. So we've seen Rome grow year after year, and I think that's almost a miracle. Now we're about to look at the family structure in Roman society. How did the how did the Romans make families in the first century? And what did they look like? But before we start that, you should know, both the Greek and the Roman empires were highly gendered society. Men were in control of everything, even the home, especially the home actually, along with just about everything else. And we really don't know why men in Rome preferred small families in this huge empire, right? But they did. And this was especially true with the upper class men. They didn't want big families. And when I was looking into this, I actually read scholarship saying they probably didn't like children. That's why they didn't. But it makes sense, not necessarily scholarship. But we're going to look at the realities of raising a family. And after we do that, I'll bet that you'll agree it's a miracle there were any children to grow up and become part of the Roman Empire, because there were so many impediments to the healthy natural birth of a child. And childbirth was so dangerous for the mother and for the baby. Infant mortality rates were alarmingly high, and pregnancy in women was one of the leading causes of death for women in the first century. And if you made it to delivery, mothers had a 50-50 chance of surviving a childbirth. And 40% of babies died in the first year.
No wonder there were few children.
And it's amazing, right? And the babies who did survive birth, only 50% of them made it to their 10th birthday. So most mothers and babies died from natural causes, but not all of them. So let's look at this. But before we even look at birth, we should look at contraception, because it was commonly used in Roman society. Remember, men didn't want big families, and that could be dangerous to the mother. So many women in first century Rome, they were using a plant called silphium. Silphium, you bought it, you boiled it, and then you drank it. And it was a common contraceptive. So it must have worked, and we're not really sure. I couldn't find any statistics about how effective it was, but most people must have had some faith in it, because the plant was harvested to extinction. We only know about it in an archaeological sense. It's gone like the Gauls. So then they found a new plant, a type of latex plant. That became a popular substitute. But the wrong dosage of the latex plant would not only kill the baby in utero, it would also kill the mother. And then there were all types and all forms of barrier contraception. Are you familiar with this type of contraception? Most of these were also very dangerous to the woman and not very effective. One of them was inserting stones into the vagina of the woman to stop the flow of sperm to the egg. Now, another contraceptive device used by women were garlic bulbs, specially grown garlic bulbs, inserted into the same place to be used as a sperm barrier. So I'm like, you just gotta leave it to the Italians, right? They put garlic in everything. I was like, and of course, we know abortion was also common. There were all kinds of potions and herbal mixtures that were meant to kill the fetus, and these could very easily kill the mother as well. But maybe the risk to her own life was easier to bear than it was to bear a child that the father didn't want. Now, as we've mentioned before, there were ways in first century Rome to get rid of unwanted children, even children who were born healthy. And one way was a practice called exposure. Exposure, it involved taking a live child to the town dump and leaving the baby there, right among the trash of the town. And sometimes someone came and took the baby out of the garbage, but mostly the babies died. And we should remember that exposure and all kinds of infanticide, they were all legal in Rome. There were no rules about protecting life. And please don't think that that signals some ancient notion of the modern Roe versus Wade crusade. Don't picture Roman women walking around in their toga saying, "My body, my choice." You would never hear that in Rome, and not in Greece either, because these decisions about women's bodies, they were not made by women. Preventing babies, abortions during pregnancies, killing the babies after birth, all these decisions were made by the father, the patria, the head of the house. It was always his prerogative. He was the one who decided if he would raise up the child. That's a Roman legal term. He would raise up the child, and that would mean that he would take responsibility for it. You know, like in that movie when, I don't know, the little monkey raises up Mustafa or whatever the baby
Lion
is.
King.
Yes, Lion King. Yes. But, you know, when you raise up the child, you agree to take responsibility for some period of time. Now, if he didn't raise up the child, he would kill the child. And all this was perfectly legal in Rome. And the Greek fathers could do this too, but they didn't do it as often as the Romans. Greeks mostly killed just female babies, because sons were the preferred product in Greece. But in Rome, sometimes baby killing was viewed as a statement of principle, a way to teach your wife a lesson. If the husband suspected that the wife might be having an affair or thinking about having an affair, and it's possible that the child that she's carrying might not be his, he killed the child at his earliest convenience, in utero or after birth. And that mother of the child, it could have been his mistress or his wife, she had no legal recourse. And in Rome, it was considered normal for a well-to-do, well-behaved married woman to have 3 kids maximum. I thought that was interesting. If she did that, she got a special reward, like a plaque to hang on her wall that said, I did my duty, I contributed to the population. And in just a couple of minutes, we'll talk about the other roles of women in Rome. So mostly we'll talk about how the lives of women were pretty much regulated by men. And this is particularly evident in the upper classes. Now, it's interesting. When I was writing this program, I discovered it was obvious that ancient men were practically ignored by 19th and early 20th century scholars. They weren't writing about them, and they weren't writing about the women ancient men were marrying and slept with and lived with. Probably, said one scholar, 21st century scholar, female, probably because the ancient men pretty much ignored ancient women. Ancient men seem to have spent most of their time with other ancient men. Well, 21st century scholars have refocused the examination. Both sexes are being carefully studied now. But when you read the historiography, most ancient men, I think, thought and believed like Cicero, the famous philosopher. He said, what's the point of looking at women? Intelligent men have much more important things to do. Studying women, writing about women, it's a waste of time. Cicero was absolutely certain that women had very little or no sense of judgment. And what judgment they did have, it was unreliable and weak, so you couldn't trust it. And this was the judgment of ancient upper class educated men. And they're talking about their upper class wives. You can't trust that female judgment. So you can only imagine how Roman men felt about slave women and prostitutes and just everyday normal women. Now just for a second, stop and think. Who made up the first group of people, which was the largest group of people, that followed that Jewish preacher named Jesus? Who were they?
Women.
Yeah, the powerless. They were women and slaves. Women were among the earliest converts to what became Christianity. I found that very interesting. And if you don't believe me, read Luke. He was the earliest feminist. You'll love him. But now let's get back to Rome. Now, a lot about what we hear about Rome is very similar to what we heard about Greece, right? Especially when it comes to marriage. You were expected to get married, and people married young, before the age of 20. And everyone was expected to get married. And your reputation mattered. You brought that to your marriage. Especially women brought it. So if you were kind of a hoochie girl, right, before you got married, your reputation could hurt your husband's reputation. And the laws of the empire were very clear about this. They said, do not ever humiliate or belittle your husband's reputation. So we can see, I hope we can see, that marriage was viewed then much differently than it is today. Especially about this. Back in the day, you weren't expected to love who you married. Love was always considered a good thing, but it was considered more a matter of luck. If the couple loved each other before they got married, they were lucky. But no one really expected that. But the couple was expected to produce children. The empire needs citizens to keep growing, but there didn't seem to be a big push to keep the couples together. So divorce was very similar, I think, in many ways to what divorce is today. Way too common, right? And it was very common and very easy to get divorced in Rome. And the divorce in Rome meant that the dad got the kids, all of them. The mother didn't even have visitation rights. And we know that dads didn't have to love their children. Dads didn't even have to promise to take care of their children. Dads could divorce their children too, like they did their wives. And they did regularly. The fathers disowned them, their own children. You're dead to me. So fathers, husbands, they had all the power. The women didn't have any. So, of course, women had to learn how they could use men to get the power that was denied to them. And they did, of course. Just think Agrippina and her son Nero. Now, I know you've heard of Nero, but Agrippina, she was a hoot. Really good stories, kind of sad though in a way. These were very strange, powerful people. And if there was ever a story about a woman wanting power, it was Agrippina. She was probably the most connected woman in the Roman Empire. Her father was a big hotshot, Germanicus, and her mother, who was also named Agrippina, she was probably the smartest woman in the Roman Empire. And Agrippina's brother was Caligula. You've heard of him, right? He was an emperor. And I think it's so interesting. He's just, to me, when I hear his name, it's like evil incorporated. But he had to have a little sweet side because he let his little sister, when she was a preteen, sit in the Colosseum with him in the good seats to watch the gladiator games. Now, women weren't permitted to sit in those seats. So it was like this big, but it was, I guess, a mini scandal. But Agrippina's whole life was filled with scandalos, giant scandals. She married Claudius, who became an emperor, and then she gave birth to Nero, who also became an emperor. And it was Nero who had his mother assassinated, arranged for it. So all her connections didn't help her stay alive, right? And they didn't advance the rights of women. Women pretty much stayed powerless. Women couldn't vote, of course, they couldn't hold office, and they really couldn't spend much time outside of their homes, out of the house, in the public eye. They sort of lived their entire lives on house arrest all the time. And this was mostly true for the upper class. They didn't go to public events, and they didn't go to the markets or to the shops. They sent their slaves out to do the shopping. And I thought it was interesting and more than a little ironic that the lower class women in Rome actually had more power than their richer sisters, because lower class women, they were out in the world. Every day they had to go out and work, either in the factories or in the markets, or they worked in rich people's homes and on their estates. So these women, they learned what was going on, and they could use that information to make their lives and the lives of their children better. And also interesting, lower class women could go to the theater, and they could go to the public baths, and they could even go to the gladiator shows at the Colosseum. They could even go to the races at the Circus Maximus. But like I told you, they had to sit way up in the nosebleed seats. They weren't allowed any of the good seats except for Agrippina, just for a short time. She had a front row seat, but not the other women. And by the way, I was wondering, did you know that there were female gladiators?
No.
Fighting.
Where did
You heard of them?
Never heard.
No. You did?
I think I saw it on TV
They had a
recently.
special, it was either on PBS
Yes.
or one of the.
There were women
Yeah,
gladiators. I
historic,
was
like, Smithsonian or something like that, one of them.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Not too long ago.
Yeah.
no, not as much as men. Women are so much smarter than men.
Women are so what?
Maybe just a little, maybe not so much, but
Smarter than some men.
some men, yes, but some women in Rome were trained to kill other women. So there were women fighting women for entertainment. And I remember reading some scholar, a male scholar, said, well, this was baby steps in the fight for equality. Who is this man, right? But good Roman women, they weren't gladiators, and they weren't even allowed to go see the gladiator shows. In fact, good Roman women were not allowed to see any shows, and it was the duty of good Roman men to keep their wives pure and away from such trashy entertainment. So of course, good Roman men became good Roman hypocrites, right? Now, does any of this sound familiar to us, right? Roman men left their good wives at home, and they spent their time with prostitutes or with their mistresses and with their boy lovers and also with married women, but at least their wives stayed pure. And speaking of pure, there was a group of women in Rome who are still famous for their purity. Do you know who they are?
Nuns?
They kind of grew into that, but they didn't start out as nuns. They started out as Vestal virgins. I didn't have a lot of time these last few weeks to really get into getting to know the VVs. At first I thought it was going to be really boring because this was a group of women, right? Elite women, specifically chosen and trained to serve the Roman goddess Vesta. But nobody knows a lot about Vesta. She must have been lovely, because they only picked pretty girls to serve her. But we don't have any statues of Vesta. There are lots of statues, but they weren't worshipped in her temple in Rome. But we do know that she was hot, literally, because Vesta was represented in her temple in Rome by a fire, and it was the job of the Vestal virgins to keep the fire burning, no matter what. So I suppose it wasn't really a bad job taking care of that sacred flame, but see what you think. VVs were chosen as children about the age of 6. Girl was taken from her home, away from her family, and taken to Vesta's temple in Rome, where she was instructed for 10 years on how to be a Vestal virgin. 10 years. So either these girls were really slow, right? Or there were a lot of secrets about VVs that I couldn't find. In fact, I couldn't find much information about their training specifically, but I did find some things about what they were supposed to do. I know that they had to leave the temple and go out to the fountains near the aqueduct to get water and bring it back to the temple, and they tended to the fire. And it is clearly stated in the Vestal Virgin Manual that fire is not just a fire, it's a symbol for all of Rome to see the power of the Virgin Goddess of Rome. Well, that's baloney, because it really was just a fire. It just burned. It didn't heat anything. There were no ducts going out from this front fire that filtered into the temple. And it didn't generate any power. It wasn't used for cooking. But I guess in some ways it did generate power, because there was a belief among the people of Rome that the Virgin Goddess provided protection for Rome through that fire. And many believe the existence of Rome and the entire Roman Empire needed that fire to survive, to grow. So this group of virgins, there were a lot of them, but there were only 7 of them on fire patrol. They kind of rotated. They were totally dedicated. Thank you so much.
They will call you.
Sorry?
They'll be calling you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, darling.
Can I, interrupt 1 second? Can I pass these out to anybody want a Madeline?
Yes, anybody want a Madeline? She was a little
Gluten-free?
devil.
Anybody?
Sure.
Okay.
So actually, the Vestal Virgins kind of developed into an important religious group, like you were talking about nuns, a religious group. So each 6-year-old trains for 10 years on how to keep the fire burning, and then finally she's allowed to practice what she learned. And typically a VV stayed a VV for 30 years. And then you were relieved of your duties, at least your fire duties. And then you had to leave the temple. But you could live in the real world then. And you didn't have to be a virgin anymore. But from what I could read, most VVs stayed virgins. And those who did survive the 30-year service, I think in many ways they were quite fortunate. I think they got a pretty good retirement package, good pension. But they had, no, I'm serious, it's actually listed in the cost of the empire. But they had their freedom, which in many ways was so much better than being something of like a sitting duck in the temple, being judged by everyone. Everybody could walk by and see you doing what you did. So working as a VV at the temple could be dangerous. You were open to all kinds of criticisms and finger pointing. Like you could be accused of not being a virgin while you lived at the temple. And that was a crime that was punishable by death. And if she was a sloppy firekeeper, punishable by death. But not just any death, it was a horrible death. So listen to this. The young girl or young woman was buried alive.
Oh.
Sometimes she was put right into the dirt, and then dirt was, which was probably an easier death, being buried alive that way, rather than being buried in an underground, tiny little chamber. Reading about this just gave me the willies. You were, imagine just being lowered by a rope down into this tiny hole in the ground, no air vents, of course, and you had this little container of water and this little bag of food. So you either choked to death, coughing, unable to breathe, or you died slowly of starvation, no water, all alone. But I think even worse than being lowered into that chamber was being walled alive. They actually built in a section of the temple a place for your body to be, and then they built the wall around you. So you were buried into the wall of the temple, and you could hear everything that was going on while you slowly died an agonizing death. But don't feel sorry for them, because they knew this going in, and they did it all for Vesta, whose protection was essential for the safety of Rome and the empire. And just imagine, that whole idea lasted well into the 4th century CE. Hundreds of years until Christianity took over the empire, and that ended the reign of the Vestal Virgins. Or is the reign really ended? Or are men still obsessed with virginity? Do some men still think that it is imperative that I am the only one who will ever own her virginity? As if that were ever possible, right? Some men still write about this and still search, go online searching, and want confirmation, medical, scientific confirmation. But do you know anybody like that? No, not since Christianity showed up on the scene, did away with that. Now, virginity is just a crazy old-fashioned idea, right? Right out of the old-fashioned Roman Empire. It sounds almost silly, right? Like celibacy. Imagine being celibate for life. Whose idea was that? Well, it wasn't an early Christian idea. And the idea that sex is a gift from God that's supposed to be enjoyed on a regular basis. Where did that come from? Well, it didn't come from the Romans, didn't come from the Greeks. Yeah, it came from the Jews.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a law. You can read it in your ketubah. Did you find her ketubah?
I had it
Oh, ask her. I'm dying to hear what she agreed to. Yeah, it's always good to know what they expect in their men, right? Well, life in the Roman Empire wasn't half as nice as the movies show it was, right? It wasn't all pomp and ceremony. But believe it or not, Roman society could be somewhat tolerant religiously. As a Roman citizen, you had a right to worship your own gods, as long as you didn't make waves. Because if things got dicey in Roman city, if the little people, the plebeians, the slaves, if they were unhappy and they made waves, the Roman government had a plan for that. And we read a little bit about that when we looked at Juvenal. Juvenal called the Roman plan to deal with civil unrest, he called that a system of state-sponsored bribery. Just give the little people a little more food, a little more bread, and a little more fun at the games. Give them free tickets to the races at the Circus Maximus. And this was a good system because it worked. The system of bread and circuses. It worked for a while until another way to bring a little joy into their lives was offered by a little group of believers who believed in the Jewish Jesus. And this group also offered bread. And ironically, some of the new believers in early Christianity actually became unwilling participants in those Colosseum games. Remember, they became lion food, right? But still, freedom of religion seems to have been accepted, but only if religious tolerance kept the peace in the empire. And the Romans tried to keep the peace, but there were definitely non-negotiable items, like the idea that the Roman emperor was a god, or the son of God, who demanded to be worshipped. This was non-negotiable for Rome, and this was a non-starter for Jews and for early Christians. But Jesus found a way to make that work. Remember, he said, pay taxes to the empire and the emperor. But then last week we saw how the Jews reacted to that idea. And we saw that if another group of believers made trouble for the empire, that group would not be tolerated, like in the Hanukkah Wars. But if things were moving along smoothly, other religions were tolerated, because the Roman government had more of a world focus than a provincial focus. They wanted it to function properly, to make money so that they could get bigger by defeating other armies and getting the vanquished to pay them taxes so the empire could keep getting bigger. That was the plan. So the Roman government didn't really care about what was in your mind or your soul. They cared about what was in your pocket. and how they could get that out of your pocket and into their. Now, does any of this sound familiar? You know, we're reading this ancient. So, if skinny little Israel, way over there in Judea, Romans thought, hey, if they want to limit themselves to just one God, a God that you can't even see, well, that was okay with Rome until the trouble started. Trouble would not be tolerated. If you stayed peaceful, you could stay alive. But what about after you died? What about the afterlife? What did Romans think about the afterlife? What was going to happen to them once they died? Well, probably most Romans didn't even think about that at all. They lived in a now society. They cared about the peace and the prosperity and protecting those things for now. So for most Romans, there was no such thing as an afterlife. And if any Romans, and I found a little writing about this, if they did have a vision of the afterlife, it was definitely more like hell than it was like heaven. Wasn't pleasant. Now the Greeks, they did believe that there was a place where your soul or another aspect of your body went when you died. And you could take a ferry to get there. We remember this. And if somebody put a cold, hard coin in their cold, dead hands, right? You could get on that ferry, and then you got off the ferry at a place that was run by the gods Hades and Persephone. But nobody, no Greeks really wanted to go there, because the Greeks believed that the afterlife was just this big place, crowded, filled with people who were constantly complaining and saying all this disgruntled stuff. So we can safely assume that the Greeks and the Romans weren't walking through this life to get to the afterlife. This life was mostly it for them. So many tried to make this life better and easier. So if they weren't born into money, they tried to join groups that offered friendship and purpose, a place where you could be all that you could be. So you would join the army, just for men, ladies. So let's take a look at the Roman army. Very famous. It was a premier army, always. But it's interesting. Roman army didn't consist of all Romans. It really was multicultural. And there was a draft at first, and there were plenty of volunteers, so many, in fact, that they didn't need a draft anymore. And they were professionals, top notch, and they paid very well. And did you know, when I was writing my sermon for Sunday, they were paid in salt. That's where we get the word salary. They were worth their salt, Roman soldiers. And salt was worth a lot. And if you were in the army, you were well trained and well paid, and you stayed in the army for 20 years. That was the time of deployment. And while there, you learned discipline, and that could be brutal. If you broke the rules, you could be beaten to death or stoned to death. But that was very unusual. More likely, you probably got a beating once or twice, but you would usually walk away from it. And you were glad to be a member of a well-equipped army with a pretty good medical corps that included dentists. I found that fascinating. But if you weren't really rich and you weren't in the army, then what were you? You were either slave or a plebeian. Slaves did everything, mostly for free. And I'm not sure we'll have a lot of time to cover slavery, except to make clear that Greek and Roman slavery was very different than the Atlantic trade slavery with which we are familiar. And we have to understand that Rome would not have been Rome without its slaves. And you knew who the slaves were, because they weren't allowed to wear a toga or to wear a stola as a woman. They just wore cheap, right off the rack clothing. Couldn't wear anything nice or fancy. And some private homes in Rome had at least 500 slaves. And even middle class, no, it wouldn't be middle class, it would be middle upper class, had at least 100 slaves. And think about that when you read the New Testament conversion stories. Especially in Paul, you'll read this man or this woman, Paul converted them and their entire households. So all those slaves were converted, whether they agreed or not. They all became Christians because the head of the house, the patria. But let's say you weren't a slave. Let's say you were a plebeian in the Roman Empire. And this was, in fact, the largest group. There were lots of slaves, and probably 1% of the population was uber rich. But the rest of Rome was just like the rest of us, right? Everyday Joes and Josettes, people doing their everyday jobs. And here's a quick look at some of these jobs. Now, plebeians, they didn't really have any power until they became a mob. Big danger. One little guy is just one little guy, so a general or a senator could just swat them away. But if one plebeian joins another plebeian, and these two join these two and these two, and so on, then you've got a mob that has to be controlled, held back, held down. And hold that thought as we look at the jobs the plebeians were holding. Now remember, this was the largest tax-paying group in Rome, and they worked hard to feed their families, put a roof over their heads, get to a gladiator show once in a while, but they really worked hard to pay their taxes. They had no choice. And here's what they did. Most of them couldn't read or write, but they kept the empire running. And most of them worked as unskilled workers, day laborers at the bottom of the employment scale. And they were paid the least, but there were plenty of craftsmen, trained and talented, and of course they earned more than the day laborers. And plenty of men joined the Roman army, and they were paid better. But I forgot to tell you, those Roman soldiers had to pay for their own uniforms. And was that true in the American army ever? Did you have to pay for your own? You did.
Oh, yeah.
I think that is like so unfair. They make you wear, right?
Uniform.
Interesting. Romans, I wonder if they got it from the Romans. And you had to pay for your own weapons, some of your weapons, personal weapons. But Roman soldiers did get a really good pension. And I'm not that sure that's true for veterans, but of course there were lawyers in the Roman Empire, and they made 8 times more than the soldiers did.
Donna, didn't you say a couple weeks ago that the average length of a person's life was about 30 years?
If you were a woman. If you were a woman, Roman men lived, men lived longer than women, which is why you'll often see an older man with a young woman, because they remarry. You know, you have a 50-50 chance, okay, you know, so.
Or they died in childbirth.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Doctors did pretty well, but if they had a celebrity client, they did really well. They made more money. And if you had a little money and you were willing to lend money at ridiculously high prices, you could get rich. You could kind of do pretty well lending money, but the people who worked as fortune tellers, they could make a fortune, depending on who they were telling those fortunes to. And there were a group of fortune tellers, and this is true, who made their living by reading the poop of your chickens. And they were held in high regard, and they were paid appropriately. Entertainers were paid decently, gladiators. And I thought this was so interesting. I was like, duh, why didn't I think of this before? Gladiators were not paid by the month or the year, because they could, you know,
That lived that long.
bite the bucket, or so to speak, whatever. No, they were paid a fee per fight, you know, every time they fought. And they weren't paid accordingly to who they fought. Like the people who fought the lions, they didn't get paid much more. But, you know, before I mentioned female gladiators, and I forgot to mention, the best paid gladiators in the Colosseum were dwarf gladiators. Did you ever hear that?
No.
Apparently, I'm very serious about this. The dwarfs were imported, and I couldn't find out where they came from. Like, where do you import dwarfs, right? But they were paid so well because they provided much needed comic relief in the Colosseum. And since they were so expensive to import, they didn't kill those guys, so. You just gotta love those Romans, right? So sensible. And here's another job, you're not gonna believe me, but it's a real job. The orgy planner, triple X-rated job actually, had to provide X-rated entertainment for all the X-rated parties, which were called orgies. But how about this job? The urine tax collector. There really was such a thing. Because the Romans taxed everything. Now does that sound familiar, right? So certain industries in Rome actually used urine in the production of some products, like tanners. They soaked hides in urine so that they could make leather and suede. So urine was considered by some to be a valuable chemical. And did you know that in Rome, urine was also used in the manufacture of toothpaste? I actually saw that it would keep your teeth whiter. So does that sound familiar? So it was taxed, of course. And feces, there was a need for men to collect feces, so it could be taxed. And I am not making this up. There were actually positions, I found it on the city expenditures, there were positions called shit collectors. This is real life Rome. It was part of the waste management of the city, the shit collector. So for your convenience, he would drive his shit collecting cart that was labeled to your home or your place of business, pick up your shit for a fee, of course, and then the shit collector would drive that cart to the country and sell your shit for a profit as a fertilizer to the local farmers. So talk about that movie, right, that cartoon, the
Yeah.
circle of life,
Yeah.
right?
Capitalism. Capitalism.
Capitalism.
Yeah.
And it was good for Rome because they taxed every step of the process. Now, as I mentioned, if you had a little money, you could lend it out at ridiculously high interest rates and make a really good profit. At least you could, before the Jews made it a law that you couldn't. Those Jews were such troublemakers in Rome. And those early Christians, well, they just picked up all the bad stuff from the Jews. So thank the gods that there were emperors like Caesar to protect the empire from Christians and Jews. So of course the best job in the empire was being an emperor, right? Until the Jews and the Christians ruined that too. So I thought it was so interesting and so fascinating to learn how some Jews who followed Jesus started a movement that eventually became bigger than the Roman Empire. Great topic. We could have done a whole series on it. How did the Romans go from killing Christians in the Colosseum to worshiping them with their churches? But I'm going to jump ahead. We're going to look two aspects of this topic. from two scholars who have proposed an explanation of how this could have happened. And we'll finish with that today. And I'll start with Dr. Bart Aram. He's sort of a controversial scholar. He's a specialist in early Christianity, and he taught at the University of North Carolina for a long time at Chapel Hill. In fact, he just retired January 30th, about the same time he turned 70, so I know he'll keep working. Now, the other scholar that I'm citing today is Dr. Ramsey McMullen, and he taught at Yale from 1967 to 1993. So he wasn't there when I was there, but his scholarship was. We learned it and we used it. He was a Roman history scholar, and he wrote a lot about this historical question and answer about the spread of Christianity in the empire. And both these scholars offer a two-part explanation, which are best summed up with just two words: exclusivity, and evangelism. God bless you. That's what made me think that you were maybe looking ahead, Sherry. Evangelism. And here's very briefly, I know I'm talking too much. Here's their theory. Very complex, really deserves more nuance of interpretation. But briefly, here's what they say. Christianity clearly stated, if you join our club, you can't be in any other club. You have to be exclusively Christian. Like, you can't be part Christian and part pagan. You can't say, Jesus is my Savior, but you know, I wouldn't get through this day if I didn't have Zeus, you know, that head god helping me through this day. Now, you can't do that in Christianity. So think about that for a moment, because that idea is totally new to this ancient world. So let's say that you're an everyday pagan who worships Zeus. And then all of a sudden you meet the person of your dreams, and that person worships Apollo. You want to get together, well, no problemo, right? Because you can easily skip your worship from Zeus to Apollo and still remain a pagan in good standing. But you can't do that with Christianity. Christ worship is exclusive. You just can't slip Zeus or Apollo in there with Jesus. So if you go the Christianity route, you have to get off the pagan path. Now, we can understand that, right? It has to happen. And according to those two scholars, and many more like them, that's what happened over time, of course. So let's assume two evangelical, missionary type guys come to your city, and everyone in your city, wait, you guys have to go. We can, yes, and we can all go, because I don't want to keep you longer. Are we good?
I was just looking forward to see what you were going to say.
All right, I'll finish it real fast. So these two guys come to convert you. One guy is a Christian, and the other one is a pagan who worships Apollo. And they want to convert you and your neighbors, and they know it won't be easy, so they hold this big meeting, like a big revival meeting. And 100 of your neighbors come with you to the meeting, and let's assume that both of these recruiters are good, equally good. So out of that group of 100, the pagan recruiter gets 50 converts, and the Christian recruiter also gets 50 converts. So it's even Steven, right?
Right now.
Wrong, wrong, wrong. Because look at what really happened. The pagan converter got 50, but he lost 50 to the Christian converter.
Oh.
So the score is now 50 less for the pagans and 50 more for the Christians. So Christians gain 50 but lose none. pagans gain 50, but they lose 50. So see, the Christians can't lose. And they didn't. They gained more and more converts as time went on. And Christianity really is still growing, particularly in Africa, pagan land, in Asia, right? And it's growing. Many scholars will contend just this way. And I think when we get together again, you know, and certainly when we delve into Mark, we'll see what this means for us, what Christianity meant, the growth of Christianity around the world, and it is still growing. What does that mean for us today and for the world that we live in? But now, safe trip, don't speed to get where you have to go. I wish you all shalom, and I'll see you. If you have time this week, open Mark's Gospel. It's only 15 chapters and they're short, but just get an idea of what he wants you to know. I think you'll enjoy it. So thank you, God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.